There's a moment when someone who's been smiling through decades of pain finally stops pretending. And when that someone is Steve Harvey, one of America's most beloved entertainers, the whole world stops to listen. On what seemed like just another ordinary Family Feud taping, a contestant said 7 words that would shatter 30 years of carefully constructed armor. What happened next wasn't scripted, wasn't rehearsed, and wasn't anything America had seen from Steve Harvey before. This is the story of the day Steve Harvey finally said what every black entertainer has been holding back, and why that moment changed everything. But to understand why it mattered, you need to know what he'd been carrying all along. Steve Harvey wasn't supposed to make it. That's what the statistics said. That's what his circumstances screamed. Born in West Virginia to a coal miner father, raised in Cleveland in a neighborhood where dreams went to die, Steve learned early that survival required more than talent. It required an armor most people never have to build. And his armor was a smile. But before that smile became worth millions, before it lit up television screens across America, it was tested in ways that would have broken most people. There were 3 years, 3 long, brutal years, where Steve Harvey was technically homeless. He'd quit his job to chase comedy full-time, a decision that looked insane to everyone who knew him. He slept in his 1976 Ford when gigs were too far apart to afford hotels. He washed up in gas station bathrooms. He wore the same suit until it practically stood up on its own. And through it all, through the hunger and the humiliation and the crushing uncertainty, he kept that smile plastered on his face. Because the moment he walked on stage, nobody could know. Nobody could see the cracks. What people don't understand about being a black entertainer climbing up from nothing is that you're not just performing your act. You're performing your entire existence. Steve learned this in comedy clubs, where he was often the only black comedian on the lineup, where he had to be twice as funny to get half the applause, where one bad set could mean he'd never get called back while white comedians got second and third chances. He learned it in meetings where executives would smile and nod and then book someone safer, someone who didn't make them uncomfortable, someone who fit their narrow definition of marketable. The smile became his survival tool. Not just a smile, the smile. The one that said, "I'm harmless, I'm likable, I'm here to make you comfortable." It opened doors that would have stayed locked otherwise. It got him the Steve Harvey Show in 1996, a sitcom that ran for 6 seasons and made him a household name. It got him radio. It got him books. It got him hosting gigs that turned into empires. That smile was worth everything. But what the audience never saw was the weight behind it. The constant calculation of every word, every gesture, every reaction. Steve couldn't afford to be angry on camera, even when he had every right to be. He couldn't afford to be too black, whatever that meant, because white audiences needed to feel comfortable, and advertisers needed to feel safe. He had to code switch so smoothly that nobody noticed he was speaking 2 different languages depending on who was in the room. He had to laugh at jokes that weren't funny and smile through comments that cut deep and never, ever let them see him sweat. There were rooms where he was the first, the only, the one black face in a sea of white executives making decisions about his career, his image, his worth. And in those rooms, Steve learned that his success wasn't just his own. It was carrying the weight of every black entertainer who would come after him. One mistake, and he'd confirm their worst stereotypes. One moment of anger, and he'd be labeled difficult, uppity, a problem. One crack in that smile, and the opportunities would evaporate like they'd never existed. So he smiled, through exhaustion, through microaggressions that people swore weren't racist, through watching less talented people get opportunities he had to beg for, through the suffocating pressure of knowing that he wasn't just representing himself. He was representing an entire race in the eyes of people who were looking for any excuse to write him off. By the time Family Feud came along in 2010, Steve Harvey had perfected the performance. He'd turned that show into a cultural phenomenon, not just because he was funny, but because he'd mastered the art of making everyone feel comfortable. White families loved him. Black families loved him. He could crack jokes that walked the line without crossing it, could improvise moments that went viral, could turn ordinary people into stars for their 15 seconds of fame. He made it look effortless, but effortless is a lie. Behind every perfectly timed reaction, every viral moment, every episode that made millions of people laugh, there was 3 decades of weight Steve Harvey had been carrying in silence. The knowledge that his success was conditional, that it could be taken away the moment he stopped performing, that the smile wasn't just part of the job, it was the job. He'd built an empire on that foundation. Multiple shows, best-selling books, sold-out comedy tours, a production company, a brand that stretched across media platforms. Steve Harvey wasn't just successful, he was an institution. And institutions don't crack, they don't break, they don't stop smiling. Except empires built on buried pain don't stand forever. The weight of 3 decades doesn't just disappear because you're successful now, because you've made it, because you've proven everyone wrong. That weight sits in your chest, getting heavier with every microaggression you swallow, every racist comment you laugh off. Every moment you have to choose between your dignity and your career. Steve Harvey had made that choice thousands of times. He'd chosen the smile. He'd chosen the performance. He'd chosen to make everyone else comfortable at the expense of his own peace. And for 30 years, it had worked. He'd won. He'd made it to the top of an industry that wasn't built for people who looked like him. But what Steve didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that on one ordinary day, during one ordinary taping of Family Feud, a single sentence was about to undo decades of carefully constructed armor. The foundation was about to crack wide open. And when it did, America was about to see something it had never seen from Steve Harvey before. The truth. What Steve didn't know was that a single sentence was about to undo decades of carefully constructed armor. The studio lights were the same as they'd been for thousands of tapings. Bright, hot, unforgiving. The kind of lights that make everything look perfect on camera while slowly draining the life out of everyone under them. But Steve Harvey had long since stopped noticing. This was his domain, his kingdom. Family Feud wasn't just a show, it was a well-oiled machine, and Steve was the engine that made it run. It was supposed to be episode number God knows what in a season that had already produced dozens of viral moments. The audience was warmed up, laughing at all the right times, ready to play their part in the carefully choreographed dance of game show television. The families were positioned at their podiums, nervous energy radiating off them in waves. And Steve Harvey was doing what he'd done thousands of times before, walking that line between scripted and spontaneous, making ordinary people feel extraordinary for their brief moment in the spotlight. The rhythm was predictable in the best way. Ask the question, wait for the answer, react with perfectly calibrated surprise or amusement or mock horror. Make the contestant feel seen, make the audience laugh, keep the energy high, keep everyone comfortable. It was a formula Steve had perfected to the point where he could do it in his sleep. A new contestant stepped up to the podium. Middle-aged white man, polo shirt. The kind of guy who probably told people at barbecues that he didn't see color. He had that look, the one Steve had learned to recognize over decades in the industry. That comfortable confidence that comes from never having to question whether you belong in a space. The assumption that every room is your room. Steve extended his hand like he always did. The smile was already in place. That $1,000,000 smile that had opened every door, that had built the empire, that had become as much a part of his brand as his mustache. He was ready to make this stranger feel like the most important person in the room, to create another moment of connection that would make good television. But then the man opened his mouth. 7 words. That's all it took. 7 words that cut through the studio like a blade, like a knife sliding. Between ribs, finding the exact spot where 30 years of buried pain had been festering. The man said, with a smile of his own, with the casual comfort of someone who didn't think he was saying anything wrong, that he missed the old days before people like Steve were on TV. The old days. People like you. Time didn't just slow down. It stopped. The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like the air being sucked out of the room. Someone in the front row made a sound that was half shock, half horror. The production team froze, cameras still rolling because nobody had given the signal to cut. Nobody knew what to do with what had just happened. And Steve Harvey's smile, that armor he'd been wearing for 30 years, that weapon he'd wielded to survive in an industry that wasn't built for him, didn't come automatically. For the first time in his career, maybe for the first time in his life on camera, the smile didn't appear. Instead, something else crossed his face. Something raw and unfiltered and dangerous. His hand, which had been extended for a handshake, dropped to his side. His body language shifted in a way that made everyone in the studio suddenly aware that they were watching something unprecedented. The playful host persona evaporated like it had never existed. What stood in its place was a man who'd just been punched in the gut by 7 words that represented everything he'd been swallowing for decades. The cameras captured it all. The microsecond where his face changed from welcoming to something harder, something that looked like 3 decades of exhaustion finally finding its way to the surface. The moment his eyes shifted from performative warmth to genuine hurt, mixed with barely contained rage. The instant where the mask didn't just slip, it shattered. The contestant seemed to realize too late that he'd crossed a line he didn't even know existed. His smile faltered. The confidence drained from his face. He started to stammer something about it being a joke, about not meaning anything by it, about Steve being too sensitive. But the words died in his throat because everyone in that studio could see what was happening. This wasn't going to be laughed off. This wasn't going to be smoothed over with a quick joke and a commercial break. What the contestant didn't understand, what he couldn't understand, was that those 7 words weren't just an insult. They were a time machine. They transported Steve Harvey back to every moment where he'd been made to feel like he didn't belong. Every audition where they'd said they weren't looking for his type. Every meeting where his ideas were dismissed until a white colleague repeated them verbatim. Every time he'd had to smile through someone's nostalgia for an era when people who looked like him couldn't even walk through the front door of this studio. The old days. The contestant missed the old days, and Steve knew exactly what those days looked like. Those were the days of segregation, of whites-only water fountains, of black entertainers having to enter through the back door and eat in separate dining rooms and sleep in separate hotels even after they'd performed for white audiences. Those were the days when someone like Steve Harvey hosting a primetime television show wasn't just unlikely. It was illegal in some places, unthinkable in others. The silence in the studio was deafening. Nobody moved. The other contestants looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. The audience members who'd been laughing and clapping moments before were now frozen, unsure whether to look at Steve or look away, unsure whether the cameras were still rolling, unsure what was supposed to happen next. But this wasn't in the script. There was no teleprompter for this moment. No producer in Steve's ear telling him how to handle it. This was uncharted territory, and everyone watching, in the studio and eventually millions at home, could feel it. They were about to witness something that wasn't rehearsed, wasn't planned, wasn't part of the carefully constructed world of game show television. This was real. And it was about to get raw. Steve Harvey stood there, silent for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds. His jaw was tight. His hands had curled into fists at his sides. The energy radiating off him was something the audience had never seen before. Not playful frustration, not mock anger, but genuine fury mixed with profound hurt, mixed with 3 decades of exhaustion from carrying a weight nobody should have to carry. The contestant tried again to backtrack, to explain, to make it better. He said something about growing up watching different shows, about how television used to be, about how he didn't mean it the way it sounded. But every word he spoke only made it worse, because what he was really saying, what Steve could hear beneath the stammering excuses, was that he genuinely did miss a time when people like Steve Harvey weren't allowed to exist in this space. And something inside Steve Harvey finally snapped. Not violently, not with yelling or cursing or physical aggression, but something fundamental broke loose. The dam that had been holding back 30 years of truth. 30 years of swallowed insults, 30 years of smiling through pain. The armor cracked. The performance ended. And what emerged was something far more powerful than anger. It was honesty. Steve Harvey opened his mouth to respond, and everyone in that studio knew, they could feel it in their bones, that what came next would change everything. This wasn't going to be a smooth recovery. This wasn't going to be a moment he could joke away. The foundation had cracked wide open, and there was no putting it back together. The cameras kept rolling. The production team held their breath. The audience sat in stunned silence. And Steve Harvey, for the first time in his career, stopped performing. But the comment itself wasn't the devastating part. It was everything that comment represented, everything Steve had been carrying in silence. Before Steve could respond, before he could form words, before he could decide what version of himself to present in this moment, there was silence. Not the comfortable silence of a pause for dramatic effect, not the manufactured silence of a game show waiting for an answer. This was the heavy, suffocating silence of a reckoning. And in that silence, 3 decades of weight came crashing down like an avalanche that had been building on a mountain nobody else could see. This wasn't just about one ignorant comment from one contestant who thought he was being clever or funny or honest. This wasn't about 7 words spoken by a middle-aged man in a polo shirt who probably went home and told his wife about his day on Family Feud without understanding what he detonated. This was about every single moment Steve Harvey had swallowed his truth to survive in an industry that demanded his talent, but not his humanity. The weight was invisible to everyone watching, but it was crushing Steve from the inside out. It was the weight of being the first black host of a major game show, and knowing that every mistake would be used as evidence that they shouldn't have taken a chance on someone like him. It was the weight of walking into pitch meetings where he was the only black face in a room full of executives who smiled and nodded and then made decisions about his career without ever asking what he thought, what he wanted, what his vision was. It was the weight of code switching so constantly, so automatically, that he sometimes forgot which version of himself was real. The Steve Harvey who spoke to black audiences, who could relax into the rhythms and references and cultural touchstones that felt like home. And the Steve Harvey who spoke to white audiences, who smoothed out the edges, who made himself palatable, who performed a version of blackness that was entertaining but never threatening, funny but never angry, present but never too present. What the audience didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that this exhausting performance wasn't just part of the job. It was the job. Every single day, Steve Harvey had to make white audiences comfortable. He had to be funny in a way that didn't make them feel guilty. He had to acknowledge race in a way that didn't make them feel accused. He had to exist in their spaces while making them feel like they were doing him a favor by letting him in. And the meetings. God, the meetings. The countless times Steve had pitched an idea, laid out a vision, explained exactly why something would work, only to watch executives nod politely and then dismiss it. But then, and this happened so often it became a dark joke, he told himself, a white colleague would repeat the exact same idea, sometimes word for word, and suddenly it was brilliant. Suddenly it was exactly what they'd been looking for. Suddenly it was greenlit. Steve learned not to fight it. Fighting it meant being difficult. Being difficult meant being replaceable. And being replaceable meant losing everything he'd built. So he smiled through it. He let his ideas be stolen and repackaged and presented by people who'd never had to sleep in their car or wash up in gas station bathrooms or wonder if this gig would be the last one. He swallowed the rage and the humiliation and told himself it was the price of success. But the real weight, the crushing, suffocating weight that sat in his chest every single day, was the knowledge that one mistake could cost him everything. One moment of anger, one crack in the armor, one time where he stopped smiling and told the truth about what it felt like to navigate this industry as a black man, and it would all evaporate. The shows, the deals, the opportunities, the empire he'd built, all of it was conditional on his continued performance of palatability. White hosts could have bad days. They could be grumpy or difficult or demanding. They could snap at producers or complain about working conditions or push back on creative decisions. But Steve Harvey? He had to be grateful. He had to be easy to work with. He had to make everyone around him feel comfortable even when they made him profoundly uncomfortable. Because if he didn't, there were 1,000 executives ready to say that he was the problem, that they'd given him a chance and he'd blown it, that maybe they should go back to hosts who were easier to manage. The weight was in every room where he was the only one, the only black executive in the production meeting, the only black face at the network up front, the only black host in the lineup. And in those rooms, Steve wasn't just representing himself, he was representing every black entertainer who would come after him. He was carrying the hopes of people who looked like him and dreamed of making it in this industry. He was bearing the burden of being a first, knowing that if he failed, it would be used as evidence that they shouldn't take chances on others. So he never complained, never let them see him sweat, never stopped smiling. Even when the smile felt like it was cracking his face. Even when the exhaustion was so bone deep that he couldn't remember what it felt like to just exist without performing. Even when he wanted to scream at the injustice of having to be twice as good to get half the credit, of having to smile through microaggressions that people swore weren't racist, of having to pretend that everything was fine when nothing was fine. The contestants' old days weren't just words. They were a portal to everything Steve had been running from. Everything he'd been trying to prove wasn't still true. Everything he'd been desperately hoping America had moved past. But that comment proved what Steve had always known in his gut. For some people, for too many people, those old days were better. Not because the television was better or the entertainment was better, but because people like Steve Harvey knew their place. Because they weren't on TV. Because they weren't in positions of power or visibility or influence. Steve knew exactly what those days looked like. He'd heard the stories from black entertainers who came before him, the legends who'd paved the way. Those were the days when Sammy Davis Jr. could perform for white audiences at the Sands in Las Vegas, but couldn't sleep in the hotel or eat in the restaurant or enter through the front door. Those were the days when Nat King Cole had his own television show, but couldn't find a sponsor because advertisers didn't want to be associated with a black host. Those were the days when Hattie McDaniel won an Oscar for Gone with the Wind, but had to sit in a segregated section at the ceremony. Those were the days when people who looked like Steve Harvey couldn't eat at the same lunch counters, couldn't drink from the same water fountains, couldn't stay in the same hotels, couldn't vote without risking their lives, couldn't walk down the street without the threat of violence hanging over them like a storm cloud. Those were the days when a black man hosting a primetime television show wasn't just unlikely. It was unthinkable, impossible, illegal in the minds of people who believed that some humans were worth more than others based solely on the color of their skin. Those old days weren't nostalgia. They weren't a simpler time or a better era or something to long for. They were a nightmare. They were systematic dehumanization. They were violence and oppression and the crushing denial of basic dignity. And this contestant, standing on a stage that Steve Harvey had earned through decades of grinding work and swallowed pain, had the audacity to say he missed them. And something inside Steve Harvey finally snapped. Not the loud snap of something breaking violently. The quiet snap of something that had been stretched too thin for too long, finally reaching its breaking point. The snap of a man who'd spent 30 years performing palatability, deciding that maybe, just maybe, the performance wasn't worth it anymore. The snap of someone who'd built an empire on making others comfortable, realizing that he'd sacrificed his own peace in the process. The weight that had been invisible to everyone else was suddenly visible on Steve's face. The exhaustion, the hurt, the rage, the profound weariness of having to explain again and again why comments like this weren't harmless, why nostalgia for segregation wasn't innocent, why longing for a time when people like him didn't exist in these spaces was violence dressed up as preference. The studio was still silent. The cameras were still rolling. The contestant was still stammering, still trying to backtrack, still not understanding that there was no walking this back. And Steve Harvey, for the first time in his career, stopped calculating what his response should be and just let himself feel what he was feeling. When he finally opened his mouth to respond, what came out wasn't anger. It was something far more powerful. And when he finally opened his mouth to respond, what came out wasn't anger. It was something far more powerful. Steve Harvey didn't yell. He didn't curse. He didn't raise his voice or lose control or give anyone the satisfaction of watching him become the angry black man they could dismiss and forget. Instead, he did something far more terrifying. He told the truth. Not the polished, media-trained, PR-approved truth that gets packaged for morning show interviews and motivational speeches. Not the sanitized version that makes white audiences feel good about how far we've come as a society. The real truth. The raw, unfiltered, uncomfortable truth that strips away all the convenient lies we tell ourselves about progress and equality and post-racial America. His voice was steady when he started speaking, but there was something underneath it. A tremor, a crack, decades of suppressed exhaustion finally finding its way to the surface like water breaking through a dam that had been holding back an ocean. He looked at the contestant, really looked at him, and asked if he understood what he'd just said. If he comprehended what those 7 words actually meant. If he had any concept of what the old days he was longing for actually looked like for people who weren't white. For people who weren't afforded the luxury of nostalgia, because those days were defined by their systematic oppression. The contestant tried to speak, tried to explain again, tried to backtrack with the same tired excuses that Steve had heard 1,000 times before. But Steve held up a hand, not aggressively, not dismissively. Just a simple gesture that said he needed this man to listen, really listen, maybe for the first time in his privileged life. And then Steve Harvey began to unpack 30 years of wait in front of a live studio audience and cameras that were capturing every single word, every micro-expression, every moment of this unprecedented unraveling. He told them about the nights sleeping in his car. Not as a funny anecdote or a motivational story about overcoming adversity that gets applause and inspires people to chase their dreams, but as the brutal, dehumanizing reality of what it took for a black man to break into an industry that didn't want him, that had never been designed for him, that saw his presence as a threat to the natural order of things. He described washing up in gas station bathrooms, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, while he tried to make himself presentable enough to perform. He talked about wearing the same suit until it was threadbare and shiny, until the fabric was so worn he could see through it in certain light, because he couldn't afford another one, and nobody was going to give him one. Steve described going days without eating, because he had to choose between food and gas, money to get to the next gig, between survival today and the possibility of opportunity tomorrow. He talked about the physical pain of hunger, the way it gnawed at his insides during performances, the way he had to smile through it and be funny while his stomach was eating itself. He described the shame of it, the humiliation of being a grown man who couldn't afford to feed himself, who had to calculate whether he could spare $3 for a burger, or if that $3 might be the difference between making it to the next city or being stranded on the side of the road. He talked about performing in clubs where he was the only black comedian on the lineup, where he'd walk on stage and feel the energy shift, feel the audience tense up, feel them deciding in real time whether they were going to give him a chance or write him off before he even opened his mouth. Steve described having to be twice as funny to get half the applause, having to work 3 times as hard to get the same opportunities that mediocre white comedians got handed to them. He talked about watching white comedians bomb, absolutely die on stage, and then get invited back the next week because they had potential, because everyone has off nights, because they deserved another chance. But when Steve had a bad set, when the jokes didn't land or the timing was off, that was it. The door closed. The phone stopped ringing. Because he didn't get second chances, he got one shot to prove he belonged, and if he missed it, that was evidence that people like him didn't belong in the first place. The studio was silent. Not the manufactured silence of people waiting for the next joke or the next game show moment or the next viral clip. The silence of people confronting something they'd never had to think about before, something they'd been comfortable ignoring their entire lives. You could hear people breathing. You could hear the air conditioning humming. You could hear someone in the back row sniffling, crying quietly. You could hear the weight of truth settling over the room like a heavy blanket, suffocating and necessary all at once. Steve talked about the doors that had been slammed in his face, not metaphorical doors, actual rooms he'd been excluded from, actual opportunities he'd been denied, because his face didn't fit what executives thought success should look like. He described auditions where they'd told him, with apologetic smiles and corporate politeness, that they weren't looking for his type. What they meant, what they could never quite say out loud, was that they weren't looking for black, that the role had already been cast in their minds before he walked in, and that role was white, that his talent was irrelevant because his skin color made him wrong for the part, wrong for the show, wrong for the image they were trying to project. He described meetings where his ideas were dismissed with patronizing nods and empty promises to circle back later, where he'd pitch a concept, lay out exactly why it would work, explain the audience and the market and the potential, only to watch executives glance at each other with expressions that said they weren't taking him seriously. And then, weeks or months later, he'd see his exact idea greenlit with a white host attached. The same concept he'd pitched, the same structure he'd outlined, the same vision he'd articulated. But suddenly, it was brilliant. Suddenly, it was exactly what they'd been looking for. Suddenly, it was worth investing in because the right person, the white person, had presented it. Steve talked about rooms where he was the only black face and everyone acted like that was normal, like that was fine. Like diversity meant having one person of color in a sea of whiteness and calling it progress. He described the exhaustion of being that one person, of knowing that every word he spoke would be interpreted as speaking for his entire race, that every opinion he expressed would be filtered through the lens of his blackness, rather than his expertise or his experience or his individual perspective. The contestant's face had changed dramatically. The smugness was gone, evaporated like it had never existed, replaced by something that looked like shame, or maybe the beginning of understanding, or maybe just the profound discomfort of having to confront the reality that his nostalgia was someone else's nightmare. He looked like he wanted to disappear, wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. Wanted to be anywhere but standing on that stage, facing the truth of what his words had revealed about himself, about his values, about what he really believed when the polite veneer was stripped away. But Steve wasn't done. He was just getting started. Because this wasn't just about one ignorant comment from one contestant who thought he was being clever or honest or funny. This was about everything that comment represented. Every microaggression he'd swallowed over 30 years. Every racist joke he'd laughed at to keep the room comfortable. Every time he'd had to code switch and perform and make himself smaller so white people could feel bigger, safer, less threatened by his presence. He talked about the constant, grinding pressure of knowing that he wasn't just representing himself. That every time he walked on stage, every time he hosted a show, every time he appeared on camera, he was representing every black entertainer who would come after him. The weight of being a first, of being one of the only, of knowing that his success or failure would be used as evidence for or against an entire race of people. One mistake, and he'd confirm every racist stereotype that executives whispered in boardrooms. One moment of anger, and he'd be labeled difficult, uppity, a problem that needed to be managed or eliminated. One crack in the smile, and the opportunities would dry up like they'd never existed, and the doors that had been so hard to open would slam shut again. Steve described what it felt like to live with that calculation running constantly in the background of his mind like software he couldn't shut down. To measure every word before speaking it, to gauge every reaction before showing it, to perform palatability every single moment of every single day, because the alternative was losing everything he'd worked for, everything he'd sacrificed for, everything he'd built from nothing. He talked about the exhaustion of it, the soul-crushing weariness of never being able to just exist without performing, without strategizing, without protecting white people from their own discomfort with his blackness. The audience was transfixed. Some people were crying openly now, tears streaming down their faces as they confronted truths they'd never had to face before. Others looked like they'd been punched in the stomach, like the air had been knocked out of them. A few looked angry, defensive, like they wanted to argue but couldn't find the words, couldn't formulate a rebuttal that didn't reveal their own complicity in the systems Steve was describing. And Steve just kept talking, kept unloading, kept speaking truth that had been building up for 3 decades with nowhere to go, no outlet, no release valve. He told them about the meetings where he'd had to smile through comments that cut deep, where someone would say something casually racist, a joke about black people, a stereotype presented as observation, a comment about the old days when things were simpler. And then, look at him, waiting for him to laugh, to give them permission, to absolve them of their prejudice. And he'd learned to laugh. He'd learned to make them comfortable, because not laughing meant being difficult. And being difficult meant being replaceable. And being replaceable meant going back to sleeping in his car, back to gas station bathrooms, back to choosing between food and gas money. Steve talked about what those old days the contestant missed actually meant, not in abstract terms or historical footnotes or sanitized textbook descriptions, but in concrete, visceral reality. Those were the days of segregation, of whites-only water fountains and lunch counters and swimming pools, of black people being denied service at restaurants, being spat on for trying to sit at the wrong counter, being beaten for trying to exercise basic human rights that white people took for granted. Those were the days when people who looked like Steve Harvey couldn't vote without risking their lives, couldn't walk down the street without the threat of violence hanging over them like a storm cloud, couldn't dream of hosting a television show because the very idea was unthinkable, impossible, a violation of the natural order. He described the stories he'd heard from black entertainers who came before him, the legends who'd paved the way, but had to endure systematic dehumanization in the process. Performers like Sammy Davis Jr., who could entertain white audiences at the finest venues in Las Vegas, but had to enter through the back door, eat in separate dining rooms, sleep in separate hotels because his talent made him valuable, but his skin color made him unworthy of basic dignity. Artists like Nat King Cole, who had his own television show but couldn't find sponsors because advertisers didn't want to be associated with a black host, didn't want their products connected to someone who reminded white audiences that black people existed. Actors like Hattie McDaniel, who won an Oscar for playing a stereotype but had to sit in a segregated section at the ceremony, separated from her white colleagues even in her moment of triumph. Steve's voice grew stronger as he spoke, not louder, but more certain, more grounded in the truth he was finally allowing himself to speak, without filter or calculation. He asked the contestant a question that hung in the air like smoke, like something you could almost see taking shape in the space between them, taking on weight and substance. He asked if the man really missed those days, if he genuinely longed for a time when Steve Harvey couldn't even walk through the front door of this studio, let alone host a show in it. If he understood that his nostalgia for a simpler time was actually nostalgia for a time when black people knew their place and stayed in it, when they existed only to serve and entertain white people without demanding dignity or equality or basic human rights. The question wasn't rhetorical. Steve waited for an answer. The entire studio waited for an answer. And the contestant, faced with the weight of what he'd actually said, what he'd actually revealed about himself, could only shake his head, could only mumble something about not meaning it that way, about being sorry, about not understanding. And Steve nodded, not with satisfaction, but with the weary recognition of someone who'd heard those excuses 1,000 times before. Someone who knew that not meaning it that way was the excuse people always used when they got called out for saying exactly what they meant. But Steve wasn't letting him off that easy. He told the contestant that intent didn't erase impact, that not meaning it that way didn't change what those words did to someone who'd spent their entire life fighting to exist in spaces that didn't want them. That being sorry wasn't enough if you didn't understand what you were sorry for. if you didn't recognize the violence embedded in longing for an era of oppression, if you walked away from this moment without fundamentally changing how you saw the world. The cameras captured every second of it. The raw emotion on Steve's face, pain and anger and exhaustion, and something that looked almost like relief. The shame on the contestant's face, the dawning realization of what he'd done. The tears in the audience, people confronting their own complicity, their own comfortable ignorance. The collective reckoning happening in real time. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This wasn't a game show. This was something far more important. It was truth-telling in a space that had been built on comfortable lies, on the fiction that racism was a thing of the past, on the myth that success meant the struggle was over. And then Steve said something that would echo far beyond that studio, far beyond that taping, far beyond anything he could have anticipated in that moment. He said that he was tired. Not just physically tired, though he was that too after 30 years of grinding, but tired of performing, tired of making other people comfortable at the expense of his own humanity, tired of smiling through pain, tired of being grateful for opportunities he'd earned 10 times over, tired of carrying weight that was never his to carry in the first place. The studio erupted, not with applause, with something deeper, something more primal, with recognition, with the sound of people seeing something they'd never seen before, and realizing they'd been blind to it their entire lives, with the catharsis of truth finally being spoken in a space that had been built on avoiding it, on smoothing it over, on pretending everything was fine when nothing was fine. But this wasn't just a moment of catharsis for Steve Harvey. It was about to become something much bigger. The taping stopped. Not gradually, not with a commercial break or a pause to reset, but abruptly, like someone had pulled the plug on reality itself. The director called cut with a voice that trembled slightly, unsure of protocol because there was no protocol for this. The producers huddled in corners, whispering urgently into headsets, trying to figure out what to do with what they'd just witnessed. The audience sat frozen in their seats, nobody quite ready to leave. Nobody sure if they were allowed to leave, everybody processing what had just happened in real time on a game show set that was supposed to be about family-friendly entertainment and viral moments that made people laugh, not cry, not confront the ugly truths about American racism. The episode never aired as planned. The network made that decision within hours, executives gathering in emergency meetings to discuss damage control and liability, and whether Steve Harvey had just violated his contract by going off script in the most spectacular way possible. They talked about reshoots, about editing, about whether they could salvage anything from the taping or if the whole thing needed to be scrapped and forgotten, buried like it had never happened. Legal teams were consulted. Crisis management firms were brought in. Everyone was in full panic mode, trying to contain something that was already far beyond containment. But someone recorded it. Of course someone recorded it. In an age where everyone has a camera in their pocket and nothing stays private for long, someone in that studio audience pulled out their phone during Steve's response and captured the whole thing. The raw emotion on his face, the tremor in his voice, the contestant's shame, the audience's tears, every single word of truth that Steve Harvey had finally allowed himself to speak after 30 years of swallowing it. The video quality was shaky, the audio slightly muffled. But the content was crystal clear and devastating in its honesty. And within hours, Steve Harvey's unfiltered response was everywhere. Not just on one platform or one corner of the internet, but everywhere simultaneously, spreading like wildfire through social media with the kind of velocity that only comes when something touches a nerve that millions of people didn't even know they had. Twitter exploded with the clip. people sharing it with captions that ranged from crying emojis to long threads analyzing every word Steve had said. The hashtag #SteveHarveyTruth started trending worldwide within 3 hours, accumulating millions of tweets from people sharing their own experiences of racism and performative palatability. Facebook lit up with debates, comment sections turning into battlegrounds, where people argued about race and progress and whether Steve had overreacted or finally said what needed to be said. Family members who'd avoided talking about race for decades suddenly found themselves in heated exchanges about what the old days really meant and who got to be nostalgic for them. Friendships were tested. Relationships were strained. The conversation was uncomfortable and necessary and long overdue. Instagram was flooded with reposts, influencers and celebrities and regular people all sharing the video with their own commentary, their own experiences, their own stories of having to smile through racism and perform palatability and carry weight that wasn't theirs to carry. Major celebrities with millions of followers added their voices to the conversation. Oprah shared it with a caption about the emotional labor Black people perform daily. Viola Davis posted about the exhaustion of code switching. LeBron James talked about carrying the weight of representation in predominantly white spaces. TikTok users created response videos, some crying as they watched Steve speak, others breaking down his words line by line. Still others sharing their own experiences of being the only person of color in white spaces and having to make everyone else comfortable at the expense of their own humanity. The video spawned countless stitches and duets, each one adding another layer of perspective, another story, another voice to the chorus of people saying, "Finally, someone said it." News outlets picked it up within hours. First the entertainment blogs, then the major networks, then the cable news channels that saw an opportunity to fill 24 hours of programming with debates and discussions and expert panels analyzing what Steve Harvey's moment meant for race relations in America. CNN ran segments about it, bringing in sociologists and cultural critics to discuss the phenomenon of Black excellence requiring palatability. Fox News had commentators arguing about it, some defending the contestants' right to nostalgia, others acknowledging the pain in Steve's response. MSNBC brought on historians to provide context about the old days the contestant had referenced and what those days actually meant for Black Americans. The segregation, the violence, the systematic denial of humanity. Millions of people who'd never watched Family Feud, who couldn't tell you what network it aired on or what time slot it occupied, were suddenly watching this clip, sharing it, crying over it, arguing about it, using it as a mirror to examine their own beliefs, their own complicity, their own comfort with systems that benefit them at the expense of others. The video became a cultural touchstone overnight, the kind of moment that divides time into before and after, the kind of thing people would reference for years as the moment they started thinking differently about race in America. For Steve, the response was overwhelming in ways he couldn't have anticipated and wasn't prepared for. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. His email inbox exploded with thousands of messages. His social media mentions became an avalanche of reactions, support and criticism, and everything in between. He sat in his dressing room after the taping, still in his suit, still processing what had just happened, watching in real time as his unfiltered truth spread across the world and took on a life of its own. Black entertainers, legends who'd been in the industry for decades, icons who'd paved the way and paid prices Steve could only imagine, reached out privately to thank him for saying what they'd never felt safe enough to say. Comedians who'd come up in the same era sent text messages telling him they'd been waiting 30 years for someone to say those words on national television. Richard Pryor's widow called to say Richard would have been proud. Chris Rock sent a message saying Steve had articulated something he'd been trying to find words for his entire career. Dave Chappelle reached out to talk about the cost of speaking truth in spaces that profit from your silence. Actors who'd broken barriers in film and television called to tell him they'd cried watching the clip, because he'd articulated something they'd been feeling their entire careers, but could never find the words or the courage or the platform to express. Denzel Washington sent a handwritten note about the weight of being first, of carrying representation, of knowing that your mistakes would be used against everyone who looked like you. Sidney Poitier's family reached out to share stories about the price Sidney paid for opening doors that had been locked for generations. Directors and producers and writers who'd spent decades navigating predominantly white spaces sent emails describing their own experiences of code switching and performing palatability and carrying the weight of representation. Ava DuVernay shared the clip with commentary about how Steve had named something that every black person in Hollywood understood, but rarely spoke about publicly. Spike Lee posted about the exhaustion of being the only black voice in rooms full of white executives who thought diversity meant tolerating one person of color. Musicians who'd crossed over to mainstream success shared stories of having to make their blackness palatable, of having to sand down the edges of their identity to fit into formats that weren't designed for them. Beyoncé's team reached out privately. Jay-Z sent a message about the business of being black in white spaces. John Legend talked about the calculation that runs constantly in the background, the measuring of words and reactions and performances. Television hosts and journalists and public figures who'd built careers on being the acceptable face of diversity thanked Steve for finally dropping the mask and showing what it cost to wear it. Don Lemon talked about the emotional labor of translating black pain for white audiences. Robin Roberts shared her own experiences of code switching in morning television. Gayle King opened up about the exhaustion of being the bridge between worlds that didn't want to meet in the middle. But there was backlash too. Immediate, vicious, predictable backlash from people who felt threatened by Steve's truth, who needed him to be wrong because if he was right, then they had to examine their own beliefs and behaviors and complicity. People accused him of overreacting, of being too sensitive, of making a mountain out of a molehill over one innocent comment that didn't mean anything. They said he was playing the race card, that he was seeing racism where none existed, that he was the real racist for bringing up the past instead of focusing on how far we'd come as a society. Conservative commentators used the clip as evidence that political correctness had gone too far, that you couldn't say anything anymore without someone getting offended, that Steve Harvey had just proven that black people were looking for reasons to be victims. They said the contestant was just expressing nostalgia for a different era of television, that there was nothing racist about preferring the shows you grew up with, that Steve had made it about race when it didn't need to be about race. Talk radio hosts dedicated entire shows to defending the contestant and attacking Steve for being divisive. Social media trolls flooded his mentions with racist slurs and threats, with memes mocking his reaction, with deliberately obtuse takes designed to minimize his experience and invalidate his pain. Some accused him of being ungrateful, of biting the hand that fed him, of forgetting that white audiences made him successful, and he should show more appreciation for the opportunities he'd been given. Others said he was washed up, past his prime, desperately trying to stay relevant by manufacturing controversy. The vitriol was relentless and exhausting, and exactly what Steve had always feared would happen if he stopped performing palatability. Some sponsors got nervous. Companies that had partnerships with Steve's production company or endorsement deals with his brand started making quiet inquiries, asking their legal teams to review contracts, wondering if they needed to distance themselves from the controversy. Marketing executives held meetings to discuss whether Steve Harvey was still the right face for their products, whether his unfiltered moment had made him too polarizing, whether associating with him would alienate the white consumers they were trying to reach. Some pulled back immediately, citing vague concerns about brand alignment and market positioning. Some executives made phone calls. Network brass who'd been happy to profit from Steve's talent suddenly worried about the controversy, about advertisers getting cold feet, about focus groups showing that some demographics were turned off by his response. They didn't say it directly. They never do. But the message was clear in their carefully chosen words and strategic pauses. They talked about the importance of staying on brand, of remembering that Family Feud was family entertainment, of not alienating the core audience that made the show profitable. The subtext was unmistakable. Maybe Steve had gone too far. Maybe he needed to walk it back. Maybe he needed to remember his place. For a terrifying moment, Steve wondered if he'd just destroyed everything he'd built by refusing to smile through one more insult. He sat alone in his dressing room, watching his phone light up with notifications, scrolling through the responses that ranged from overwhelming support to vicious attacks, and felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. Had he gone too far? Had he sacrificed his career for one moment of honesty? Had he proven right all the executives who'd ever told him that black hosts needed to be careful, needed to stay in their lane, needed to remember that their success was conditional on their continued palatability? The fear was real and visceral and all-consuming. Fear that the phone would stop ringing with job offers. Fear that the deals would evaporate. Fear that he'd become unhireable, too controversial, too much of a risk. Fear that he'd end up back where he started, sleeping in his car, washing up in gas station bathrooms, wondering if he'd ever get another shot. Fear that by finally telling his truth, he'd confirmed every racist stereotype about black people being angry or difficult or ungrateful. The terror of potential loss kept him awake that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if honesty had been worth the price he might have to pay. But then something unexpected happened, something that cut through the noise and the backlash and the fear. The contestant, the man who'd made the comment, whose 7 words had detonated 30 years of suppressed truth, released a public statement. And it wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't angry. It wasn't a non-apology that blamed Steve for being too sensitive or misunderstanding his intent. It was an apology, a real one. The kind of apology that's so rare in public discourse that people almost didn't know how to process it. The kind that acknowledges harm without making excuses, that takes responsibility without centering the person who caused the hurt, that demonstrates actual understanding rather than performative contrition. The statement was posted on his personal social media accounts and picked up immediately by news outlets hungry for the next chapter in the story. He started by acknowledging what he'd said, not trying to reframe it or soften it or claim it had been taken out of context. He repeated his own words, that he missed the old days before people like Steve Harvey were on television, and acknowledged that those words revealed something ugly about himself that he'd never been forced to confront before. He talked about growing up in a bubble, not as an excuse, but as an explanation, as context for how someone could reach middle age without ever questioning what he'd been taught about race and hierarchy, and who deserves to occupy which spaces. He described a childhood in predominantly white suburbs, a life insulated from the realities that people of color navigate every single day, an existence where he'd never had to think about race, because his whiteness was the default, the norm, the standard against which everything else was measured. He talked about never questioning what he'd been taught, the subtle and not so subtle messages he'd absorbed about whose stories mattered, whose faces belonged on television, whose experiences counted as universal versus whose were seen as niche or specific or political. The casual racism that had been normalized in his family and his community. The jokes and comments and assumptions that went unchallenged because everyone around him shared the same worldview, the same unexamined beliefs about the natural order of things. He described how Steve's words had shattered something in him that needed to be shattered. Not in vague, abstract terms, but with specific, painful honesty. He talked about watching the clip of Steve's response over and over, each viewing forcing him to confront another layer of his own prejudice, his own complicity, his own comfort with systems that elevated people who looked like him while making people like Steve fight 3 times as hard for half the recognition. The contestant wrote about the shame he felt, not the performative shame of someone who got caught saying something racist, but the deeper shame of realizing that his nostalgia for the old days was actually nostalgia for a time when he didn't have to share space with people of color, when he didn't have to question his own privilege, when the world was arranged for his comfort at the expense of others' humanity. He described crying as he watched Steve speak, feeling something crack open inside him that he didn't even know had been closed. He didn't ask for forgiveness. That was the most powerful part. He didn't center himself or his feelings or his journey of growth. He didn't ask Steve to absolve him or thank him for learning or validate his evolution. He just acknowledged the harm he'd caused, took full responsibility for it, and thanked Steve for having the courage to speak truth even when, especially when, the truth was uncomfortable for white people to hear. The statement ended with a commitment to do better, not in vague platitudes, but in concrete terms. He talked about educating himself, about seeking out Black voices and Black stories, about examining his own biases and assumptions, about having uncomfortable conversations with other white people in his life who might hold similar beliefs. He pledged to donate to organizations fighting racial injustice. He committed to using his own platform, however small, to amplify marginalized voices rather than speaking over them. He listed specific books he was reading, organizations he was supporting, conversations he was having with his own family about unlearning racism. And in that moment, millions of people watching realized they'd just witnessed something rare. Something that almost never happens in our polarized, defensive, everyone doubled down culture. A moment where honesty actually broke through, where vulnerability defeated prejudice, where one man's refusal to keep smiling changed not just the conversation, but potentially the hearts and minds of people who needed changing. The response to the contestant's apology was almost as overwhelming as the response to Steve's original moment. People shared it with commentary about how rare it is to see someone genuinely reckon with their own racism rather than deflecting or making excuses. Educators used it as a teaching tool, an example of what accountability actually looks like. Activists cautiously praised it, while noting that one good apology doesn't undo systemic racism, that individual growth is necessary but not sufficient, that the work of dismantling white supremacy requires more than moments of personal revelation. And Steve Harvey, reading the statement in his dressing room with tears streaming down his face, felt something shift. Not the fear of having destroyed his career, but something else. Something that felt like validation, like vindication, like proof that speaking truth, even when it's terrifying, even when it might cost you everything, can actually change something, can actually reach people, can actually matter. Steve Harvey had finally said what every Black entertainer had been holding back for decades, what they'd been taught to swallow and smile through and never, ever speak out loud if they wanted to keep working, keep succeeding, keep existing in spaces that were never designed for them. And the world was listening. Not just listening, but hearing. Not just hearing, but responding. Not just responding, but changing. And in that moment, Steve Harvey understood that the weight he'd been carrying for 30 years, the weight of representation, of code switching, of making white people comfortable, had finally been set down. Not because racism was solved or because the industry had fundamentally changed, but because he'd finally given himself permission to stop performing palatability and start speaking truth.